Dimitar?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. We can hear you in the room as well.
All right.
Do you see Ivan?
I see Ivan, yes.
Ciao, Dimi.
Ciao.
Good. Okay.
Кажи, kad možemo.
Okay. We are recording and we will soon open the room. Okay, we can technically start.
A warm welcome to all of you who are with us this afternoon in Vienna, Austria at the Institute for Human Sciences. A warm welcome to these not only geopolitical times, but Zoom times that we live in. We have a few of our fellows from the Institute here with us, but most others are virtually with us on screens. This is a welcome to the Europe's Futures Fellowship based at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna with the generous support of the Erste Foundation. This is our third year of the fellowship, and as in the previous years, we have had a number of fellows join us. This year we have 8 fellows, and you will in succession be hearing from them about their projects and about the fellowship and the work that we do here. The unusual times that we live have impeded us to have our cohort of fellows with us, as we have done in the previous 2 years here in Vienna in September at the Institute. And as everybody else, we have had to adapt, do a sort of a perestroika as we advance in the work at the Institute and with the fellowship itself. We will have 8 fellows in succession, and to open the series, we have my friend and colleague, and it's a real pleasure and honor to have him with us, Dr. Dimitar Bechev, who is originally from Bulgaria, but is currently in the United States at the University of North Carolina, from where he reaches us. So among all other things, this is a transatlantic venture in these difficult times of transatlanticism. I'd just like to briefly introduce Dimitar before I give him the floor to give his talk, lecture in and for this opening colloquium. Dimitar, as I said, originates from Bulgaria. He has been a Balkan scholar for many years. He is teaching currently at the University of North Carolina and will very soon, in a few weeks' time, move back to Europe, actually to the United Kingdom, where he will take up a position at King's College, working at the Russia Institute, and maybe he can tell us a few words about that. He has written a very prominent and noticed book called Rival Power, about the influence of Russia in the region of Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, in 2017, and is currently working on a book on Turkey and under Erdoğan. He is going to talk to us today about, the title of his talk is the EU Periphery, European Union periphery, and revisionist powers, which obviously, as those of you who are cognoscenti of his work and of the problems that we are tackling, is about what is euphemistically called the third party actors, such as Russia, China, Turkey, the Emirates, and the rest. And just before I give the floor to Dimitar, for those of you who do not know about the Institute or the fellowship, just 2 words about this fellowship. It came about 3 years ago. As I said, we're in our 3rd year, and we subtitle it as Ideas for Action. We are somewhere at the intersection of academia and think tank policy work. We have 3 key areas that we look at within the fellowship, or rather the fellows are looking at, and those are European foreign and security policy. We look at the issues of democracy and the problems and challenges that democracy has encountered. Call it regression, backsliding, whatever you wish. And then thirdly, we look at the issue of the enlargement to the Western Balkans as the last remaining core part of geographic Europe that is as yet unintegrated, and to see how in US parlance we can see a Europe whole and free and at peace. Fellows work either on one of the 3 topics or a combination of the 3. And so we continue this year with the fellows, and you will see as they present their work in the colloquia here that we have a range of extremely interesting and timely topics, whether it's the issue of the rule of law, the freedom of media, territoriality, and the like. Thank you for being patient to hear Dimitar, and now I hand it over to Dimitar for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for this generous introduction. It's a great honor to be part of this year's cohort at the Europe's Future Initiative, the Institute of Human Sciences, and I recognize it's an atypical year. So let me start my remarks by bringing you closer to the start of the pandemic in Europe. On the 15th of March, President Vučić of Serbia introduced the lockdown in his country. At the press conference, he unveiled the restrictive measures. He made a striking statement about the European Union. He famously, or infamously, I should say, called European integration a fairy tale. He also referred to China as a helping hand in the situation, and blamed European policymakers of double standards, that they were preventing Serbia from procuring life-saving medical equipment, whilst at the same time preventing Belgrade from opening its public procurement to Chinese companies. So Europe was being blamed of being hypocritical, trying to stop China's advances in Southeast Europe, but in Serbia in particular, while at the same time not being there for ordinary Serbs at the difficult time. No sooner that Chinese planes delivered personal protective equipment and other medical supplies, including face masks, to Belgrade, in front of TV cameras, President Vučić was making a show by kissing the Chinese flag, and also not several days later on, you saw billboards in Belgrade paid for by a pro-government tabloid. And I'll come back to the issue of media and the media narratives and how that shapes our image of geopolitical competition, where you had Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, with a caption in Serbian, "Thank you, brother Xi." So there was China helping Serbia in a critical moment. But it was not just China. Also, Vučić was on the phone with Vladimir Putin. And there was a delivery of Russian assistance to the Batajnica airport, which incidentally is the site where the two militaries have been staging various joint activities since 2014. So the Ministry of Defense in Russia was also chipping in and also providing medical stuff as well as supplies in a gesture of soft power, essentially. Vučić was also seen marching on the Red Square for the anniversary of the victory of Soviet Russia against Nazi Germany. That was, of course, postponed. It didn't take place on the 9th of May, but rather, I think, if it's not mistaken, on the 23rd of June, which is the day after the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. And on top of that, there was a Turkey dimension too. Turkey using a NATO mechanism, a multilateral mechanism for relief assistance, did send as well personal protective equipment to the whole of the Western Balkans, including Serbia. And that was a symbolic moment which came to show the changing constellation in the region. In other words, that the EU was no longer the only game in town, at least at the symbolic level. Of course, as the EU representative in Serbia quickly pointed out, at the end of the day, the country received much more in terms of both immediate relief, but also long-term assistance, especially after the EU's own package was put in place several weeks down the line. But what really matters in this game are representations and symbolism. And even if President Vučić walked down his remarks and gave credit to the EU, what grabbed the headlines was his overtures to China. And this is a very interesting moment because it shows that all the kind of assumptions we've been working on with regard to Southeast Europe as one of the peripheries of the European Union. And I must say my talk today will be mostly focused on the Balkans, but I'll try to make some parallels later with other parts of Eastern Europe, especially in the post-Soviet space, but all working assumptions that European integration is the only way a game is in town, that sooner or later those countries will conform with the script, will join the economic space, which has already happened, but also the normative and the institutional space of the European Union and converge, are being put to the test. So my project at the IWM seeks to inquire into this dynamic of this new multipolarity and how it plays out in countries like Serbia and its neighbors. So what I want to do now, first of all, is just have a look at the big picture, the global geopolitical reshuffle, and say a few words about how it affects Europe, and then proceed to describe very briefly and in broad strokes. And by the way, how much time do I have, Ivan, for this talk?
You have 40 minutes.
Okay, that's what I assumed. So I want to say a few words about China, Russia, and Turkey each, to look at their policies and to some degree the responses from the region to all those three. And by way of showcasing my argument early on, I think those three are very different from one another, and I'll explain why. And lastly, I want to end up with a couple of hypotheses and lines of inquiry, which will be very much central to what I want to do in my project. So what is the broad geopolitical picture? If you sit here in Washington, D.C., in the U.S. think tanks, academic centers, I think there is a consensus that the unipolar moment we were familiar with 20 years ago, and certainly peaked with the Bush administration in the early 2000s, it is over. First of all, because structurally, the US is not as hegemonic. It doesn't have such a hegemonic presence as it used to 20 years ago. Just to give you a rough figure, in 2001, I think China accounted for something like 4% of global GDP. These days, and again, this is very relative how you calculate GDP, whether it's in purchasing power terms and nominal terms, but it's anywhere between 15 and 17% of global GDP. So in relative terms, and this is a very rough measure of power, China has become much more prominent on the world stage, and you see repercussions certainly in the southern hemisphere, Africa being an early recruit to the Chinese, but also growingly in Europe. And the COVID-19 crisis brought this point home in Southeast Europe, but also elsewhere on the continent. Secondly, you have other competitors rising. Russia will be a case in point. So Russia's share of the global economy, unlike China's, hasn't changed dramatically. But what has changed is the ability and the willingness of Russia to project power, starting with its own neighborhood. The 2008 war in Georgia was an early wake-up call, but then we saw Crimea in March 2014. And you could dismiss Russia at this point, saying that it's a regional actor, as President Obama did at the time, and it can throw its weight around in its immediate neighborhood, but it's not as consequential on the global stage, except for maybe nuclear weapons, where it's in terms of capability, it's a peer to the United States. But in 2015, we saw Russia able to project power further afield with the intervention in Syria. Essentially, Moscow filled the gap left behind by the US, and with relatively modest resources established itself as the ultimate power broker in this critical conflict in the vicinity of Europe. And as we see, as we know very well in Europe, the repercussions of the fighting in Syria are felt across Southeast Europe, Central Europe. The 2016 refugee crisis was very much an outcome. But what really matters is Russia's ability to be a key player in geopolitically important region as the Middle East. I have the pleasure to edit a book on Russia in the Middle East, and you see its footprint growing, not just in Syria, but in a bunch of other places. But this is not the subject of our talk. So beyond structural change, also the unwillingness of the US to act and the introspection, which is very much one of the themes running with the election of Donald Trump to the presidency in 2016, leaves much more scope for others to act, the Russians and the Chinese first and foremost, but not only. Now, this is the big picture, but what I want to also say is that this dynamic is felt on the European periphery, where you have Russia and Turkey being much more visible than in the past. And EU and NATO enlargement is put to a halt to a great degree. Of course, NATO enlarged to Montenegro and now North Macedonia, but on these fault lines where actually the previous US administration saw potential to have much greater NATO involvement, as in the post-Soviet space that is off. Emmanuel Macron's vision of internal consolidation as having the priority over further expansion shapes the EU agenda. As we speak right now, the EU is debating its new migration pact, but also the big highlight from this year is certainly the agreement on the budget and the repercussions of this multi-annual financial framework for EU solidarity. So this is what matters to the EU, not accepting new member states, but making sure that what is in sight is propped up and also upgraded, especially with Brexit. And this leaves plenty of space for others to project influence on the European periphery, starting with the Western Balkans, but also in places like the Eastern European periphery, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and also the Caucasus. And again, I won't talk that much about that part. It will be mostly about the Balkans I'll look at. They have resources they could bring to bear. And as the Russian example has shown, even limited resources can make huge political difference. And in the Chinese case, there's a financial backbone to all that by way of soft loans that have reshaped perceptions of China and countries on the Western Balkan periphery. But what's most important is that they also bring their normative baggage. So these are not democracies by any measures. If you look at the three, Turkey, China, and Russia, Turkey is the closest one to having a democratic governance system. But in 2015, 2016, Turkey transitioned from being a dysfunctional democracy to being a competitive authoritarian system where you have both elements of authoritarian governance and remnants of the competitive system Turkey was building since the 1950s. Russia, transitologists accepted that it consolidated autocratic regime in the mid-2000s, certainly after 2004. And then China has never dabbled into democratic experiment. And what we had by way of green shoots of democracy, the one country, two systems regime is now being unraveled with the new legislation in Hong Kong. So even if you are skeptical about the ability of foreign powers to project their ideological model, it's clear that they represent a different mode of organizing power, organizing social relations, and thinking about leadership than what the EU normative message has been since the late 90s. So it's not just a material competition, it's also to some degree a normative competition. Now, this is the big picture. As you'll see later in my talk, I have some issues with this top-down depiction, but I don't want to steal my thunder early on. What I want to do now is, in more empirical terms, look at what each of those three powers is doing concretely in the Balkans. And in the Russian case, I'll draw on the work I did on rival power. So thank you, Ivan, for kind of bringing it in your opening remarks. Now, let's look at Russia first, what Russia does in the Balkans, what it's been doing in the Balkans. There is a misconception very often that Russia is staging a comeback because it's just more visible, staging a comeback in the Balkans. I don't think it has ever left the region except for maybe a short period of time in Putin's first term in office, when some of you might remember he pulled the plug on Russian military deployments in Kosovo and Bosnia in 2003. He considered that to be a relic of the Yeltsin era that didn't do any good to Russia. But several years down the line, Russia was effectively back by 2008 with the Kosovo's unilateral independence declaration. Serbia reached back to Russia and the alliance was reconsolidated. Russian energy might became much more prominent in the region with the launch of several infrastructure projects, first and foremost South Stream, and the Russian policymakers and other actors became much more readily present in the Balkans, from Montenegro to Bosnia to Bulgaria and Greece. So the wider Balkans, not just former Yugoslavia. What happened really that we started talking about Russia is the change in Russia's relations with the West in 2011 and certainly in 2014 with annexation of Crimea. As a result, Russia chose to be playing this polling role to try to put a spanner in the works of the West, and mobilized all its resources, or a fair number of its assets and resources on the ground across Europe, but also in particular in the Western Balkans. So it became a media subject, but many of those networks, investments, power assets, pieces of leverage were already there on the ground. It's just that when Medvedev was in power, the narrative, and to some degree that was justified, was that Russia could be an easy partner, but partner nonetheless. In 2014, with the confrontation over Ukraine and Crimea, Russia chose to be a competitor. And what it started doing in the Balkans was to exploit all the weaknesses, all the regional and national level problems that could put the West in a tough spot, whether it's the Kosovo-Serbia dispute, the rise of, or the prominence of nationalist players with a grudge against the West in a number of those countries. In countries where you don't have traditional Russian-friendly attitudes, the Russian media outlets could, I mean, for example, a country like Romania or Albania, you could exploit other issues to do with cultural wars in the West. In other words, the West is pushing for LGBT rights, and not promote Russia as a positive example, but denigrate Western normative projection. So this kind of game Russia started playing became very salient in politics at both the regional and at the domestic level. And we started, of course, talking much more about Russia and obsessing about Russia's intentions and capabilities in this part of Europe, but also more broadly, not just on the Western periphery, but also in core West countries, as we came to find out with the US elections and other stories of Russian interference in consolidated democracies. Now, what I wanted to argue in, and I did argue in Rival Power, is that Russia doesn't have a strategic vision of the Western Balkans. It's not as if it wants to recreate the Soviet Union, the Cold War spheres of influence, because it doesn't have the will, but also it doesn't have the resources. One lesson of Cold War type of primacy or hegemony, it comes at a cost. It's not for nothing that Gorbachev pulled the plug and let the Central Eastern Europeans free to choose their geopolitical orientation. I mean, of course, he hoped they would choose to be on friendly terms with the remnants of the Soviet Union, but controlling directly those countries was coming with a price tag attached to Russia. So today's Russia is not paying for anyone, it's exploiting, and it's trying to have the cake and eat it. It won't pay for Serbia's deficit, in other words, but it will do business with Serbia, sell weapons to Serbians, and try to use Belgrade as an ally on issues that are closer to Russia's national interests. But what I want to say is that it's an opportunistic pairing rather than an expansionist program. And many pro-Western commentators in Europe, but also in the Balkans in particular, are obsessed about it. Russia is coming in it as a rival project. I don't think any Balkan country is likely to join the Eurasian Economic Union or the Collective Security Treaty organizations. In other words, the game Russia plays in Southeast Europe is different than the game it plays in its own neighborhood in the post-Soviet space. It's not an alternative hegemon. It's a spoiler power. And from the Russian perspective, that makes perfect sense because Putin and his entourage are convinced that the West has been promoting regime change and is meddling in Russia's own backyard. So it's totally warranted for Russia to do the same, to serve the West its own medicine and try to get some mileage out of it and maybe trade some of its assets for concessions closer to home. So this is very roughly the Russian vision, which is much more short-termist, but and is not as ambitious that we sometimes assume. But what is clearly the benefit of this approach is that it's very adaptable. So Russia sometimes, or Russian actors, rather than the Kremlin, takes a very strong position on issues like NATO enlargement. Remember the Macedonian referendum, disinformation campaign. Then it loses, right? Because if pushed to the corner, countries very often choose the West and not Russia, for reasons I'll go later into. But you can regroup, adapt, and recuperate some of your assets and recalibrate your policy. So Russia has shown also flexibility. It's not the end of the road if Montenegro joins NATO, if Serbia deepens cooperation with the West, and so on and so forth. Russia can find a new avenue to project influence. So that's my very brief take on Russia. Let's move now to Turkey. Now, you remember misconception number one was that Russia is back. It's not back, it's been there. Misconception number two is about Turkey. Turkey is not an external power the way Russia and China are. It's a Balkan country. I can go into various arguments to do with history, geography, demographics, why Turkey is a Balkan power. I'll give you one vignette. When President Erdoğan, together with, again, Alexander Vučić, who is one of the main protagonists in my talk, when they went to Novi Pazar 2-3 years ago for a visit, the crowd gathered there in Sancak, greeting Erdoğan. I mean, who are those people? I mean, typically they have their relatives in Turkey. They vacation, travel, and do business in Turkey. So there's this human bond, constituency in the Balkans, which is clearly linked to Turkey. Some estimates suggest that up to 1/3 of Turkish population has Balkan connections. And the founder of the republic was a native of the region. And so on and so forth. Istanbul is the largest urban settlement in Southeast Europe, even if you take the European part without the Asian part. Now, of course, Turkey has other regional identities. It's not just a Balkan country, it's a Middle Eastern country as well, and it's part of the Caucasus. It's a complex post-imperial polity, but there is a strong Balkan link that binds it into the region, and it's been part of regional multilateral institutions since the 1930s. It has identified itself as a regional player, and that's, I believe that's very different with Russia, which is not a Balkan country. Now, what is Turkey's game in the region? Is it a spoiler, or is it something else? Clearly, we see that at the macro level, relations between Turkey and the US, but also in the EU, are in deep crisis. Turkey, as opposed to the US in Syria, Erdoğan believes that the US was behind the 2016 coup that tried to topple him from power. And there have been multiple points of tension ever since the Obama administration, starting, I think, with the Red Lines crisis in 2013, when the US failed to intervene in Syria. That deepened clearly the rift. Turkey is doing business with Russia, also with other revisionist powers. like Iran, for instance, but also China. So it's not the Western-leaning Turkey we know from the old days. Even that is an exaggeration. Turkey has always had a complicated relationship with the West. Equally, the link with the EU is difficult. In the run-up to the Turkish presidential and parliamentary elections in May 2018, Erdoğan made a huge show. He convened a rally in Sarajevo, gathering Turks from across Western Europe, from countries like Netherlands, Germany, Austria, and projected himself as the leader of Balkan Muslims, but also Muslims in Europe. The circumstances were very indicative why he chose Sarajevo, not just because of geography, being halfway between Western Europe and Turkey, but because he was prohibited from campaigning in those core Western European countries containing millions of Turkish diaspora in 2017, 2018, that caused the crisis. So the relationship between Turkey and the European Union is fraught on the macro level. It's down to issue by issue cooperation, the migration deal from 2016, or some energy projects that bind them together. And now clearly the confrontation is much more prevalent, especially with the crisis in the East Mediterranean. So what does it mean for the Balkans? Is that competition translated into the Balkans? I still believe that Turkey is not really a competitor in the way that Russia is in the region. Of course, it has its own different policy, which runs parallel to the European ones, but I don't see Turkey pushing against EU enlargement, the region, and it's certainly been cooperative when it came to NATO. It didn't block either Montenegro or North Macedonia. It played along the old script. So in this geographical dimension of Turkish policy, you could see more of the same, even if the rhetoric and the packaging and the Erdoğan factor gives a very different flavor to the foreign policy. Some of the essentials are still there. On the economic front, people have highlighted how Turkey signs free trade agreements and pursuing investment in many of those countries. Say they bought Albania's telecom, relying on this very friendly relationship between Edi Rama and Tayyip Erdoğan. So you could see Turkey as an alternative. But at the end of the day, many of those arrangements that Turkey has done by way of free trade are an extension of the customs union between Turkey and the EU. It's been in place since 1996. In fact, if you do the maths, you could see that in wider Southeast Europe, Turkey's most important trading partner is Romania by a long stretch, just because of the EU factor and because of the size of the market. And then Bulgaria and Greece come after. So 2/3 of the trade goes to the Eastern Balkans plus Greece, not to the Western Balkans. What matters is not issues of religious identity, whether Bosniaks or Kosovars or somebody else has this kind of affinity to Turkey. It's just the EU integration overarching framework, the size of the market and the market opportunities. By the way, the Eastern Balkans trade with Turkey is balanced in the way that Serbia or Bosnia or the rest of the lot cannot. It's not the case with those countries. In other words, if you are Bulgaria, you export almost as much as you import from Turkey. The same goes for the Romanians, and it's not the case in the Western Balkans where trade is lopsided. So when it comes to Turkey, it is complicated. Turkey can be a spoiler, can make life difficult, especially at the rhetorical level, but it could be a partner as well for the West in the Balkans. It very much depends on the case by case basis. And one thing that is really important is that the Turkish agenda has changed because of this linkage between domestic politics and foreign policy. Back in the day, the Gülenist network was the vanguard of Turkish policy, of soft power projection. Now it has become a liability to the extent that 50%, that's my kind of rough impression of what Turkish diplomats and security operatives and so on and so forth in the Balkans, but also elsewhere do, is to try to clamp down on the Gülenists, force governments to extradite, seize assets and transfer them to AKP, Erdoğan-friendly NGOs and charities. So it's the extension of domestic battles that are being waged in the Balkans rather than trying to gain greater piece of the region. So that's what I have to say about Turkey. Now let's move to China, because I know that we are running probably short on time. So China is again different. It doesn't have a political agenda. It works with based on its financial strength. Those soft loans under the Belt and Road Initiative have become its primary vehicle. It doesn't have a voice. It keeps a low profile on political issues. China is a Security Council, UN Security Council permanent member, but it pretty much hides behind Russia on the Kosovo issue. It's not being very vocal. And as a result, it's acceptable to everyone. It works with pretty much everyone in the region, irrespective of the orientation of the government. And I think beyond the money, what local elites in Southeast Europe, and especially in the Western Balkans, appreciate about China is the symbolic recognition it accords to them. If you sit in Serbia again, if you have President Vučić, you're not treated as an outsider. You're treated as part of greater Southeast and Central Europe, the 17+1 initiative. So all the Western Balkans are not classified as a periphery, but part of the same bundle with the likes of Hungary, Poland, and that matters just symbolically. And secondly, when it comes to Chinese policy, I think it's clear that they want to have a group of friendly countries. One day they might join the EU and be a pro-China voice in those deliberations. Some of you might remember how Serbia 10 years ago sided with China over the Nobel Peace Prize according to Chinese dissidents. The same type of pro-Chinese behavior is likely to persist at the European level when it comes to Southeast European countries. So you're buying political friends, you're buying political influence, and also geography matters because the region could be seen as a gateway to the core European markets. So Chinese policy is much more geoeconomically driven, and it's not as political and stands in clear contrast to the Russian policy. So this is my very rough picture of what's going on in the Balkans. Now, I want to step back in the last bit of the talk and say a few words about what it means. I have one issue with the depictions of power politics in Southeast Europe at the level of big Western media, but also some of the scholars of international relations that have tried to rationalize this new multipolar moment. And my issue is the following. Very often when you try to make sense of events and processes, those people tend to write off local agency. In other words, it's all about what China does, what Russia wants to do, what the EU is doing or not doing. What is missing in those depictions, and I think there was a clear theme in my book on Russia, was the response from the locals. At the end of the day, it's the Vučićes of this world, the Đukanovićes of this world, that arbitrate those external influences. And you could see it very clearly in the Serbian case, where actually Vučić and his loyal media shifted from depicting Russia as a great ally into depicting it as a problem through its loyal media apparatus. There was a spy scandal last year in the summer. Then there was this conspiracy theory about the Russian deep state muddling the waters in the Balkans. And now, of course, there was a scandal caused by the spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, who tried to kind of depict Vučić as a minion of Washington, and there was a backlash from Serbia. So what I want to say is that all those countries and their leaders have autonomy, a sufficient degree of autonomy. Very often they play external powers against one another. You use the Russian threat to gain concessions from the West, and vice versa, you use the West to negotiate and bargain with the external powers. But it's the local player, the bottom-up players that actually make a huge difference, and they decide very often the outcomes. And that's something that is missing in the depictions. Again, another example is Tsipras in Greece, just to move away from the Western Balkans. When Tsipras was elected, the knee-jerk reaction in Western media was that he would be a proxy of Putin, and that Greece is leaning towards Russia. And what we found out a couple of years down the line is that he ended up being the promoter of Europeanization with the Prespa agreement signed with the future North Macedonia. So Greek foreign policy was not determined by Russia versus the West. It was determined by Greek priorities and what Tsipras wanted to do. And I think the same applies to Serbia, the same applies to Montenegro, and so on and so forth. So this is my message. Smaller actors have agencies. They're gatekeepers of those geopolitical processes. They manipulate dynamics. And very often, I don't have that much time to talk about it, but maybe in the Q&A, domestic politics and domestic factors shape what leaders and political elites want to achieve and how they position themselves in this dynamic. And that will be the topic of my research, building on what I had to say in rival power. That's what I want to look at during my year at IWM, understanding how this bottom-up processes work in this new shifting geopolitics on the European periphery. So thank you for your patience, and I'm looking forward to the questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Dimitar, for that broad and at the same time in-depth overview with lots of very telling examples, some more colorful than others, but important actually to show the state of affairs. And I very much concur with the last bit and the conclusion that it is the domestic that drives these issues, no matter how small these countries are. Let's remind everyone that the Western Balkans, in terms of overall population, are 18 million. These are 6 mini countries, of which Serbia is the biggest with roughly 7 million people. So we're talking literally about a micro region with small countries. And clearly, as Dimitar, the title of his book, Rival Power, suggests, and as he consistently said, in particular concerning Russia, and I would add a quote from the fellow from our first year, Stefan Lehne, Austrian diplomat who worked with Xavier Solana, who described very early on, as Russia became more assertive in the region, that Russia exerted nuisance value or spoiler in Dimitar's terms. I'll just make a few comments, maybe ask a question, then open it up for questions from our virtual audience. And that is to just quote one of the latest European Union statements, because what this theme that Dimitar is tackling is basically also in the background and in the foreground about the place of Europe, about Europe's foreign and security policy, about Europe's geopolitics. And as President Macron just said in his UN speech yesterday or today, it's about Europe asserting its sovereignty and, as he said, not allowing the world to be only a rivalry between the United States and China. So Europe trying to find its geopolitical role. And as Josep Borrell, the new High Representative of the European Union, has consistently been saying, you know, what is the European Union good for if it is unable to bring in the Western Balkans and to resolve an issue such as the contentious issue between Serbia and Kosovo? And the quote is obviously from Ursula von der Leyen in her long and in-depth overview State of the Union speech a week ago, where she literally said, the Balkans are a part of Europe. They are not just a stopover on the Silk Road. And I think it captures sort of what Dimitar has been saying to us. The fact that Europe, the European Union, has not been assertive, challenged by all its issues, whether it's Brexit, the migration crisis, Russia's role in Ukraine, its aggression and takeover of Crimea, the issues with trade with China, etc., have taken over the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years attention away from the Western Balkans, and have thus opened a space for the countries that Dimitar talked to us about to come in and exert nuisance values, be spoilers, or to find economic investment and other opportunities. And as many analysts in the European Union and the US have been saying, Russia in particular wants to put the spanner in the wheels and to at least slow down European integration, wants to show the weakness of Europe, the impossibility of Europe to put it colloquially, get its act together on something like the Western Balkans. And I think that this subject is extremely important. What we have seen recently, whether we like it or not, whether, you know, whatever we think of the current US administration, in the past 2 months, they have been more proactive with the very contentious figure of former ambassador to Germany, Grenell, who has been appointed as lead on the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, who is actually in the region, was in Pristina 2 days ago, is in Belgrade today, and the US is opening their Office of Development Financial Cooperation as the first external office, and promising investments. Now, again, a lot of symbolic politics, a lot of playing into President Trump's pre-election campaign. I won't go into the details, some of you know it, but the reason I'm saying this is that this initiative of the US, as usual, the US fast-moving machine has kicked the European Union into gear, and we're seeing much more activity by the European Union, somewhat more assertiveness. The appointment of the former Slovak Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Miroslav Lajčák as the special rep of the EU to the dialogue of Belgrade, Pristina, and the region as a whole, and the summits that he has held. He has already held 3 summits between the leaders of Serbia and Kosovo. So in a sense, there's been a good interaction, whatever the causes may have been, for Europe to, if I dare say, wake up, all summarized in this sentence of Ursula von der Leyen last week, that the Balkans are not just a stopover on the Silk Road, which I would say is diplomatic language to say the EU is there and it will be active in its pursuit of the enlargement, regardless of the fatigue, regardless of what President Macron last year did in terms of saying we need to deepen before we widen. We've been in that situation for the past 30 years, at least, in terms of European Union discussions. Not to belabor this, and I'm glad that you mentioned both Bulgaria and Greece. Dimitar, clearly this is a bigger region. And anecdotally, when you mentioned Turkey being a Balkan country, I remember when some of us were young, that there was something called the Balkan Games in the 60s and 70s, where Turkey was one of the Balkan countries playing in those games. So yes, those of us who are from the region know that Turkey is part of it also. And to say that Prime Minister Tsipras, interestingly, had to expel 2 Russian diplomats from Greece during the Prespa negotiations between Greece and North Macedonia, because the Russians were aggressively financing nationalist groups who were against the agreement, against the settlement, against North Macedonia joining NATO. So my brief question is to your country, Bulgaria, which you mentioned in terms of trade with Turkey in particular. But could you say, given that this is a region and given that it's about this spoiler value, how assertive is Russia in a country such as yours, which is both a NATO and a full EU member? And then we'll open it to the others.
Oh, Russia's position has ebbed and flowed, but there is this bottom line in bilateral relations that Russia has extensive economic presence in Bulgaria, which means that you don't really need to resort to subversion and disruption, the kind of tactics you see in the Western Balkans. The time-tested tactic of cooptation probably does a better job in the Bulgarian case. In other words, promoting all kinds of initiatives. I mean, the best example now is the Balkan Stream pipeline, which also concerns Serbia. That's the extension of Turk Stream. Bulgaria will be one of the countries that will never be a hawkish player in Brussels institutions. So you do seek accommodation with Russia. And cooptation will be the game. One other caveat about Bulgaria, and it's the same applies to Romania, is that their geostrategic situation is different from the Western Balkans. They're Black Sea nations. So they're next to Crimea with all the military capabilities heaped in the peninsula and the military buildup. So Russia has coercive capacity as well, and it can rely on it if it wants to bully Bulgaria. So the geopolitical situation of Bulgaria also makes it a soft target for the Russians. In other words, just that's a convoluted way to say that I don't expect Bulgaria to do Russia's bidding, but equally Bulgaria, whoever happens to be in government, is very unlikely to play the same game as Romania or Poland or the Baltic countries. It will be trying to toe the line and try to engage with Russia, be it because of vulnerability or because Russia has leveraged it domestically.
Okay, so here comes the first question, Dimitar, and the question goes, does Russia's silence on current Serbia-Kosovo negotiations say something on how serious they think the current push from the US is?
Well, it's very possible. I mean, it's difficult to speculate about their motives. If I want to gaze at the crystal ball, I mean, their first thought might be that they want Trump to look good. They don't want to put Trump in a bad light. And maybe that was Maria Zakharova's problem. She's not a major player. I mean, she tried to get some propaganda mileage of this Vučić situation, and maybe somebody higher up the command chain reprimanded her. But yeah, I mean, the first thought is, let's give Trump some credit by not undermining him. And secondly, that won't go anywhere anyhow. So why waste resources? This whole initiative might collapse under its own weight. And to the extent that Serbia declared it won't be recognized in Kosovo, there's nothing for Russia to lose from the situation. Let the Americans try their best and look what happened.
If I can add a few words to that, given that I'm from Serbia and that obviously I've been following this for many years. The Russians, to their credit, one must say, have always said on many occasions, we cannot be bigger Serbs than the Serbs. And if you were to translate that, it would mean if Serbia finds an agreement, we're not the ones who will stop it. Now, of course, it will have to be when one reaches a final solution of whatever kind, even without recognition by Serbia, it will have to be vetted by the United Nations Security Council, where Russia holds an important seat and a vote, because ultimately, I think what we're going to look at is a seat for Kosovo at the UN. Many have spoken about the model of the two Germanys, East and West Germany, when East Germany became a member of the UN without West Germany recognizing it as a state. And so the Russians, as you rightly said, Dimitar, and it was important to recall it, they left Kosovo in 2003 with their military, and what they did in 2008 again was symbolic military politics, which petered out very quickly. So I think that they're obviously watching it very carefully. They are a country that, quote unquote, supports Serbia in its quest to retain and support the UN resolution 1244, which says that Kosovo is de jure still a part of Serbia, even though we know that de facto it is not. So their role in the final instance will be very important. The talks are, in my view, fully driven by the European Union, but it will not happen without the United States. And this economic agreement, which I wouldn't belittle, I think that's the most important part of it when one kind of puts to the side all the aspects of what was signed in Washington. And that's the importance of the opening of this US Office of Development Financial Corporation in Belgrade yesterday to see where they can act. Where the European Union, I think, is at fault, and I think many of us have said over the years, the European Union does not know how to sell itself. The European Union, as we all know, has the greatest part of the pie of trade with the Western Balkans. It's 70%. It is doing so many infrastructure and other projects. Many of the projects that the US is now mentioning, like the highway between Belgrade and Pristina and the railroad down to the port of Durrës, these are things that are already partially being financed by the European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So, it's not smoke and mirrors, but I think we have to realize that the European Union needs to be more assertive and better at portraying the importance of what it is doing. Okay, now we're going to the next question. How would you evaluate the Russian-Turkish relationship? Is the Black Sea a potential flashpoint? What about tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean currently?
Well, that's a huge topic and it deserves a special talk. Indeed, I've written on the subject, but very briefly, it's complicated. Remember this Facebook status. The relationship going back centuries, but really reignited in the 1990s, combines competition and cooperation. And it's very much centered these days on Putin and Erdoğan, who have established a very good personal connection. It's not that they trust one another, but they seem to respect each other and are capable to do business. I mean, remember in February, very likely a Russian airstrike killed 30 Turkish servicemen in Idlib in Syria, but it didn't derail the relationship. And they found a way to renew the deal on this part of West Syria. So that they will be competing, but on a number of fronts, and Libya and Syria being first and foremost, but also they have overlapping interests elsewhere. Looking at the Black Sea, Turkish policy in the Black Sea with respect to Russia has been to accommodate Russia as much as possible and to avoid conflict. That was the case in 2008 during the Georgia War, and that was the case after the annexation of Crimea, which, let's remember, put Turkey in a very difficult spot because it changed the military balance, amongst other things, north of Turkey's border from a condominium, a Russian-Turkish condominium. The Black Sea turned into something near or very close to being a Russian lake, if you look at military assets. But what Turkey does is to subscribe to the NATO policy of containment without sticking its neck, hiding behind the multilateral format, contributing to various NATO initiatives. But this is NATO, it's not a Turkish initiative. And also pursue other means of soft balancing, for example, through cooperation with Georgia and Azerbaijan, and also with Ukraine. So Turkey has this multi vector policy without coming face to face into conflict with Russia, but weighing its options. Right now, Turkey is encircled by Russia. Russia is in Crimea, in Syria, in Armenia as well. And Turkish policymakers believe that if push comes to shove, NATO won't be there for Turkey, and the US won't be fighting for Turkey. Turkey will be left one-on-one with Russia, and that's not a good scenario. And that's why they prefer working with the Russians and doing business. But it doesn't mean there is a Turkish-Russian alliance. Having said that, I don't believe there will be showdown in the Black Sea between the two. They've shown their ability to patch up their differences and to manage conflicts. So it will be more of the same.
Okay, before I go to the next question, which I believe is from Tim Judah, I'd just like to sort of contextualize the term periphery in terms of the fact that when you look at the map of the European Union and of NATO, you see that the countries that you and we are talking about now are in fact completely encircled by the European Union and NATO. And I've used the word inner courtyard of the European Union and NATO. Yeah, clearly the Southeast European flank of Europe that neighbors with the Middle East is a periphery, definitely. But there's also this element that it is very much inside the European Union and NATO, and clearly is a link between Greece as a member state for the fastest route to the European Union, and clearly no need to remind ourselves that China has made important investments in Greece, like in the port of Piraeus, as part of their new Belt and Road initiative, and trying to, as you said, non-ideologically, but in fact, in the long run, clearly creating posts for their entry and, you know, maybe in their thoughts, dominance of a certain trade and other routes. But let me go to Tim's question. And he says, the last month suggests that you need to start a new chapter by adding the United States to this rival power scenario. The September 4th papers signed by Serbia and Kosovo in the White House are above all things that interest Trump and the US administration, including Hezbollah, Israel Energy, 5G networks, and now the US is talking about financing things like the NIS Niš-Pristina road, even though it has already been financed by the EU, something that I alluded to in my previous comment.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But my working assumption, and I might be proven wrong, is that this is just a blip. And US policy is unlikely to be deeply engaged in the Balkans. They have other fish to fry and much larger geopolitical and foreign policy issues for the US, whoever happens to win the elections in November. I think China being first and foremost. Ultimately, it will be the EU in the front seat with all the pros and cons, which you alluded to, Ivan. I mean, the EU has huge economic and might, and the region gravitates towards the EU. Getting EU's act together is another issue. How you instrumentalize that and translate it into political leverage, especially given what we know about the region, that political systems are so much resilient to transformation, to external change. So the EU transformative mission is not, it's not a cakewalk. It is difficult. All things being equal, you end up with member states in the mold of Hungary and not Scandinavian countries in 2 decades or so. But again, it will be EU's issue. EU is invested in the region. It's its own inner courtyard, let's say that. And the US will be occasionally involved, but there is no core strategic US interest at stake. And I don't see this Trump initiative going on for a long time. Even if he stays in office, he's so easily distracted that there will be a North Korea crisis, there will be something happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and there will be another Grenell doing something else, and that's how it works. The attention span is pretty short. So that is my assumption, and I think that transatlantic relationship will model through in the Balkans for the time being.
Yeah, we have no more questions in the pipeline, so we have a little more time. So anyone else who wants to ask or comment, please do. But in the meantime, let me just give a rejoinder to what Dimitar was saying and to Tim's question. I think, you know, whatever the state of geopolitics currently is, and whatever the weakness or the hesitation in practical daily politics of the European Union is, it in many ways, whether we like it or not, and I like it, remains kind of the main game in town, if not the only game, clearly because there are other actors there. It was visible in the fact, and Dimitar started out with that, the way that President Vučić talked about the fallibility of the EU being a fairy tale. Dimitar mentioned it, he had to walk back on that 10 days later when the EU, I guess, called him up, or Chancellor Merkel or someone called him up. And he then talked about the indispensable help of the European Union. He met with all the ambassadors of the European Union in Belgrade to thank the EU's efforts. And of course, the EU in the end got its act together, started sending shipments or paying for shipments to come from other places, and was more present. So clearly, in the end, when you go around the circle or the block of the neighborhood, you end up with the European Union being the main and most important partner. It was interesting when the US and Ambassador Grenell then convened a meeting in Washington that was later postponed, that President Macron invited both the president of Serbia and the prime minister of Kosovo for individual real-time visits to Paris, meeting each of them for several hours, which had not been seen over the past years. And then there was the virtual summit organized by Chancellor Merkel and President Macron with the two main representatives of Serbia and Kosovo. So suddenly you saw this, what I call the wake-up call, and the understanding that Europe must not leave the reins of power in terms of solving this to others. Having said that, the US has been constantly present in all these negotiations. When the agreement in Brussels was signed between the two countries in April 2013, if I remember correctly, Philip Rieker, who was then Deputy Assistant Secretary, now Assistant Secretary for Europe and other parts of the world, was present at the signing. 2 days after the meeting in Washington on September 4th, or 3 in Brussels on the Monday of September 7th. Matthew Palmer was present at the meeting, Deputy Assistant Secretary from the State Department. So, you know, beyond the bluster of the Oval Office and the rest, I would say in a positive sense, the bureaucracy of Washington, of State Department, probably of the Pentagon, have been closely watching them, and they will be present throughout as this issue goes forward. I think on the question, you're looking into the crystal ball, are we looking at a possible solution or finding a sort of three-quarter solution to the Serbia-Kosovo issue? I think both sides are under pressure from the European Union and from the US. Serbia in particular, I would say President Vučić has this 2/3 majority in the parliament, without going into how we got there and why there's no opposition in this parliament. But the onus is on him now to actually produce and deliver from his side towards a solution, because as I like to say, I mean, the luck that we have is that we are geographically in Europe. And then the question is posed, you know, does one want in this region a situation like in between India and Pakistan, and have 70 years of an unresolved Kashmir situation, or a Cypriot situation where for 45 years there is still no solution? Okay, we do have a question. Any thoughts on Montenegro and the previously pro-Russian Democratic Front coalition coming to power? I would add, it's not coming alone to power, but with 2 other coalitions. Dimitar.
Yeah, I mean, I'm as much in the loop as anybody else in this narrow circle we have right here, and I have only speculations. But from the early statements I've seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, even parties of the Democratic Front have softened their rhetoric on NATO. So it seems to me that they will adapt and they'll go along with the flow, not least because they have to govern in a broader coalition with pro-Western actors as well. So I don't expect any major turn in Montenegro on the macro level. Maybe there'll be tweaks in the sense that there'll be more friendly statements vis-a-vis Russia. There'll be kind of less hawkish positions and so on and so forth. But that's, again, if you go back in time, when Montenegro joined the Western sanctions in 2014, which was a critical test to its commitment. Remember, Serbia and then Macedonia didn't join, but Montenegro did at the time. But they tried to cushion the effect. Ranko Krivokapić at the time went to Moscow to debate, to talk with the Russians, just to tell them that it's not something that they're doing lightheartedly, but they had to do it. So this kind of policy is likely to become the norm with this coalition. That's my guess, unless Russia becomes this polarizing issue again. And Montenegro, in that sense, will be close to the kind of positioning countries like Bulgaria or Greece have. So we're committed to EU, we're committed to NATO, but Russia might be a partner. Let's not confront them. Let's seek dialogue. This is what I expect. And again, I might be wrong, rather than getting from 100 to 0 now, or from 0 to 100, now embracing Russia and say, you know, slam the door to NATO, and that's it. I don't expect a radical U-turn.
I agree with you, with your assessment, Dimitar, and basically falls within the framework of your conclusion that it is domestic issues that drive these countries, and that's what will happen in Montenegro. Clearly, the reality is that no one will from the new government that will be formed in a few weeks will ask for the removal of Montenegro from NATO, or stopping EU integration path, or de-recognizing Kosovo. These are the realities that, of course, like in Greece, you know, when current Prime Minister Mitsotakis was against the Prespas agreement, clearly he will not de-recognize North Macedonia or remove Greece from the Prespas agreement. Okay, I have one more question here, and it says the capital of Serbia, Belgrade, is covered by thousands of Huawei face recognition cameras. Some of the biggest polluters in Europe, Serbian ironworks in Smederevo and the copper mines in Bor, are Chinese owned. Serbia just bought Chinese armed drones. Russians own their biggest business entity, the National Oil Company. How does all that affect EU accession plans and support for Serbia?
Well, it's a big issue, and it's difficult to say because you have to look more granularly if any of those decisions or facts on the ground affect negotiations in particular policy chapters. I haven't seen any direct clash, but down the road that might become a problem because certain EU standards might clash with those choices Serbia has made. And I see already something that is brewing on the horizon, not necessarily with the National Oil Company, but with Turk Stream or Balkan Stream. In the Serbian section, Gazprom has a controlling stake, which is counter Serbia's commitment to the so-called energy community, but also it's against EU law. So at some point, Serbia, maybe not now, maybe in the distant future, which means that Vučić couldn't care less right now. But at some point, this business involvement will become an issue because it will clash with the normative arrangements in the EU acquis. But this day is not here. And one thing that is true of any politician anywhere is they don't think about the long term, they think about here and now. So it's something that we scholars and experts discuss, but I'm not quite sure that it's high on the mind of the Vučićes of this world.
Yeah, that's of course the dilemma of these countries that want to keep employment and not have the closure of these industrial complexes. They find themselves between the hammer and the anvil of unemployment, and on the other hand, accepting these investments that have as a tail all the questions that you addressed here. We have a final question from our fellow this year from Greece, Ioannis Armakolas, who says the following: I very much subscribe to the view of political autonomy and agency of Balkan leadership as opposed to their portrayal as puppets in the geopolitical games. I very much also agree about Turkey being a Balkan country with grassroots footprint. I have two relevant questions. First, if you were to compare the influence of Russia, Turkey, and China, the first two very much rely on the region's poisonous identity politics, see religion and associated ethnopolitics, whereas China can be seen as a power appealing to all. Do you see this difference as playing a role when it comes to long-term influence? And the second and final question from Ioannis is regarding the autonomy agency towards non-European powers. What is your take on whether such autonomy drastically reduces as countries close in to join the European Union, namely alignment to the European Union foreign policies?
I definitely think you have a point about China being different, being non-identity, for the lack of a better term, identity neutral, which makes it universally appealing. Whereas Turkey and Russia have instrumentalized historical narratives and identity and religion to a great extent. I mean, for example, the Turkish developmental agency TIKA, which is present in the region, has been present in the region since the 1990s. This is not an Erdoğan thing, but it has been investing into restoring various sites of worship, mosques, and other pieces of Ottoman legacy. But even that is up to a point, because the interesting part of Turkish policy in the Western Balkans is the newly forced partnership with Serbia. I mean, who would have seen the propaganda minister, or sorry, the information minister, and the Milosevic side by side with Islamist politician from Turkey. And ultimately, they speak the same language of power, clientelism, and business pragmatism, if you will. So, yeah, I mean, in general, you're right, but there's some countervailing tendencies. Likewise, with Russia, I mean, of course, in the Western Balkans, Russia is using the identity narrative, and sometimes it doesn't come from the Kremlin, it comes from various entrepreneurs like Konstantin Malafiev, who has all those assets and links and invests into various conservative Orthodox organizations, and then he goes back to Moscow to sell to the upper echelons of power his ideas and projects. But even with Russia, it's not the whole story. It's not just about orthodoxy. I mean, Bulgaria would be a good example. Some of the people who have done business with the Russians are not Orthodox Christians. I mean, the Bulgarian Turkish leadership is notoriously intertwined with some Russian business interests. It doesn't mean they're Russian proxies. They like EU money as much as they like Russian investment. But my point is that Russia has also shown capacity to diversify relations. So this is a long way of saying that identity and religion are not drivers very often, but they are instruments and they are parts of the toolkit. And those big guys, Putin and Erdoğan, have managed to inject other rules into the game, including personalistic relationship and the money factor, which makes it a bit more complicated than the portrayal about stressing historical legacies and identity bounds.
And the question of agency when they come close to the European Union.
Sorry, I missed the second point. No. Well, yes or no, because I mean the sad part about the Balkans is that European integration has been the game in town for such a long time. So many of those players have learned how to talk the talk. So there'll be a lot of lip servicing, maybe alignment, but there'll be resistance to deeper change. And again, my working assumption is all things being equal, you end up with more Hungaries, unless there's a way of the EU strengthening its conditionality, but also more importantly, galvanizing bottom up. Again, domestic politics matters. And one of the lessons learned from the new member states is that nothing really happens unless the EU comes as an ally, but not as a substitute to domestic political pressure for change. So that's the big unknown in the Western Balkans, whether there will be kind of indigenous democratic momentum. There are reasons to be skeptical, including the demography that Team Judah has discussed. There's some green shoots as well, but I'm sure we'll be debating that over many more seminars in the months and years to come.
Absolutely, and thank you for mentioning both the demography issue, which is certainly a foremost challenge for the region as the population ages and as people leave the country. And I recommend everyone reading and looking up Tim Judah's excellent work on this issue, not only while he was fellow, but continued doing it, not only for the Balkans, but also for Central and East European countries, Romania and Bulgaria. Fascinating to see that challenge. And secondly, of course, the rule of law that you mentioned, Dimitar. Are we looking at a future of more Hungaries in the European Union, or will the European Union find within itself the strength and acumen to challenge this issue? Now there's an opportunity with the multi-annual financial framework. There was an announcement that President Macron would meet Viktor Orban, if not in the next few days. We'll see what comes out of that. But there is this interlinkage that some of our Hungarian friends have talked about, you know, the humongous presence of German car factories in Hungary, and trying to keep stability and not trying to dishevel some of these issues. But all those are big questions that I'm certain we'll be tackling in the coming weeks. Dimitar, thank you very much. Great discussion, great presentation, more to follow for all of us. I'd like to mention that we will skip next Wednesday due to various obligations of a number of us, and we will resume on October 7th, Wednesday at 2 o'clock, our regular time, with Srđan Cvijić, Dr. Srđan Cvijić, who is from Serbia, but has been living for a long time in Brussels. I'll say more about him when we talk, and he will be talking about the challenges of democracy. It is and will be the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Milosevic regime in Serbia, which was, as some of you know, on October 5th, 2020, when that electoral victory was defended in the streets of Belgrade and Serbian cities by more than 500,000 people. So if not before, see you on Wednesday, October 7th at 2 p.m. European time.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being present.
Thanks.